Hello, it's Dr. Alex again, and today we're talking about osteoporosis. Now, according to the International Osteoporosis Foundation, 1 in 2 women and 1 in 5 men over the age of 50 will have a fracture due to osteoporosis at some point in their life. And clearly, that's not a rare disease. That is an epidemic hiding in plain sight. And the standard advice being handed out, which is take more calcium and drink more milk, is missing most of the picture here. Well, bone health, unfortunately, isn't quite as simple as that. What the evidence actually shows is considerably more interesting and considerably more actionable. So let's start with why calcium alone isn't the answer. So the countries around the world with the highest dairy consumption, so that's the United States and Sweden and Finland and the UK as well, these also have some of the highest rates of hip fractures. So clearly that is a pattern worth interrogating. Now, it obviously doesn't mean that dairy is harmful, and it also doesn't mean that calcium doesn't matter. What it suggests is something a bit more specific, that simply consuming large amounts of calcium, whether through dairy or supplements, doesn't automatically translate into stronger bones. And the reason for that comes down to what the body actually needs to do with calcium once it arrives. So calcium is what we call a mineral, and the body has a very specific job to do with it. And that is deposit the calcium into your bones, not into arteries, not into your kidneys, but into bone. And that process isn't automatic, and it doesn't happen just because calcium is present in the bloodstream. It depends on a whole network of other nutrients being available at the same time to direct it to the right place. And without those nutrients, calcium circulates without a proper destination, and it can end up exactly where you don't want it. Now, the EPIC study, EPIC, the EPIC study, a large European study following over 500,000 people, found that those taking calcium supplements had a higher risk of heart attack compared to those getting calcium from food alone. And that finding points directly to this problem. Isolated calcium supplementation without the nutritional cofactors the body needs to use it correctly can cause calcium to deposit in artery walls rather than bone. This is why bone health is better understood as a systems problem rather than a single nutrient problem. Bones, remember, are living tissues, constantly being broken down and rebuilt, remodeled in response to physical load and hormonal signals and inflammatory status as well, and nutritional availability. So a fracture or a broken bone isn't simply the result of too little calcium. It is the result of a biological system that has been out of balance for years, and calcium is only one variable in that system. And it's worth being clear about what kind of fracture we're actually talking about here, because obviously anybody can break a bone if the force is significant enough, if you fall from a ladder or fall off your bike. But what characterizes an osteoporotic fracture specifically is that it happens with minimal trauma, a low energy fall from standing height, or in some cases, no obvious injury at all. And we do see these. So when a bone breaks that easily, it's telling you something really important about its underlying strength. That's the fracture that we're trying to prevent with this video. So bone isn't like this sort of dead, rigid structure that most people picture in their heads. It's not like the calcium deposits you get in your kettle. Bone is very much alive. Roughly a third of bone tissue is actually made out of collagen, which is a flexible protein that gives bone its ability to bend slightly under force without snapping. The calcium and the minerals harden the bone, but the collagen is actually what stops it from shattering. So think of it like reinforced concrete. The steel rods running through it are the collagen, and the concrete itself is the mineral. So if you take out the steel, and the whole structure becomes really brittle. This is why vitamin C really matters for bone health in a way that really gets talked about, because vitamin C is what the body uses to make collagen. And without enough of it, bone gradually loses that flexibility long before anything shows up on a scan. Low-level vitamin C insufficiency is far more common than most people realise, particularly in older adults who aren't eating a wide variety of foods anymore. Magnesium is another nutrient that barely gets mentioned in bone health conversations, but it plays a really important role. Around 60% of the body's magnesium is actually stored in the bone itself. More importantly, magnesium is required to convert vitamin D into its active form, the form that the body can actually use. So if somebody is taking a vitamin D supplement to protect their bones, but their magnesium levels are low, which is really common, that vitamin D may barely be working. A 2018 analysis in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition confirmed exactly this, finding that magnesium deficiency significantly reduced how effectively the bone could use vitamin D. Now, vitamin K2 is probably the least talked about nutrient in this whole area. I bet many of you have never heard of vitamin K2. Well, K2 activates a protein called osteocalcin, which acts like a guide, physically directing calcium into bone where it belongs. K2 also activates another protein that actively prevents calcium from depositing inside your artery wall. So K2 is doing two jobs at the same time. It's pulling calcium into bone and then keeping it out of the blood vessels. Without enough K2, calcium can end up circulating in the blood without a clear destination, which helps to explain why taking isolated calcium supplements without the other surrounding nutrients can carry quite a significant cardiovascular risk. The Rotterdam study, which followed nearly 5,000 adults over 10 years, found that people with higher dietary K2 intake had significantly lower rates of artery calcification and cardiovascular death. So these nutrients, vitamin C, magnesium, and K2, do not work in isolation. They work together as a system. And this is exactly why getting calcium from whole foods tends to produce better outcomes than taking it as a supplement. Whole foods deliver everything at once in combinations that the body actually knows how to use. And here's something else really important. So bone isn't just sort of passively lost as you get older. It is actively broken down by specific cells called osteoclasts. Now think of osteoclasts as the demolition crew and osteoblasts with a B as the construction crew. So in a healthy body, these two are roughly balanced, but chronic low-grade inflammation, the kind that builds silently over years from a poor diet and excess body fat and poor sleep and inactivity as well, this directly tips that balance. It ramps up the demolition crew and slows down the construction crew, producing a steady net loss of bone density that has nothing to do with how much calcium you're eating. The other point here is visceral fat. Visceral fat is the fat stored deep around your organs in your abdomen rather than just under your skin. And it's particularly relevant here because it isn't metabolically passive. It actively produces inflammatory signals that circulate in the bloodstream and reach your bone tissue. So somebody carrying significant visceral fat, eating a poor diet, and not really exercising is damaging their bones through an inflammatory mechanism that a calcium tablet will never ever address. And I bet nobody has ever told you that. A large meta-analysis published in the Journal of Bone and Mineral Research found that a higher level of CRP, C-reactive protein, which is just a standard marker of inflammation, were independently associated with lower bone density and higher fracture risk, even after accounting for other factors. So the practical takeaway so far is significant. Anything that brings chronic inflammation down, which is eating better and losing visceral fat, so trying to shrink your waistline if it's a bit bigger than it should be, sleeping properly as well and moving properly, this is also directly protecting your bone, not as a side effect, but as a primary mechanism. So having said all of that, what should you actually be eating then? Well, the goal here isn't to cut out dairy or obsess over dairy or anything like that. The goal really is to build an eating pattern that delivers calcium alongside all the other nutrients that the body needs to actually use it properly. So leafy greens are the best place to start. That's things like kale and spinach and bok choy and collard greens and turnip greens as well. All of these are really solid calcium sources. But what makes them especially valuable is that the calcium in these vegetables is actually absorbed at a rate comparable to or higher than the calcium in milk. Bok choy, for example, has a calcium absorption rate of around 54% compared to roughly 32% for milk. And these vegetables also come with vitamin K and magnesium and vitamin C and fiber all together, exactly the combination that bone remodeling actually depends on. Beans and legumes, so things like chickpeas and lentils, these are worth including as well, and not just for the calcium content. They actually feed your gut microbiome, the community of bacteria living in your digestive system. And there's also emerging evidence that a healthy microbiome directly supports calcium absorption in the colon through these compounds produced during fiber digestion. Now, something else that's really interesting is that sesame seeds and tahini actually have a surprisingly high calcium density. A tablespoon of tahini contains roughly as much calcium as a small glass of milk, and it's one of the easiest things to add to meals without changing how you eat in any significant way. And that's another reason to make your own hummus. And prunes are actually another interesting food here. So these have actually got a big randomized controlled trial behind them. So published in Osteoporosis International, it found eating around 100 grams of prunes a day for 12 months preserved hip bone density in postmenopausal women, which is a group at particularly high fracture risk. And the proposed mechanism here is that actually the compounds in prunes directly slow down osteoclast activity with a C. They are the demolition crew, reducing the rate of bone breakdown. It's one trial, I get that, and it needs replicating, yes, but the biology makes sense and there is no downside to including them in your diet. They are full of goodness and fiber. Now, it goes without saying that no amount of good nutrition can substitute for physical load when it comes to your bones. And this is where the advice given to older adults around exercise consistently gets it wrong. Bone is living tissue that responds to mechanical stress. When force is applied to bone through muscle contractions pulling on it during exercise, the bone detects that load and then responds by laying down more tissue to handle it. The body's logic is pretty simple here. If this structure is being used heavily, it needs to be stronger. And that signal only comes from real mechanical force, which means resistance training. It means lifting weights or doing compound movements like squats or lunges, like I talk about in other videos. The Lift More trial, LIFTMOR, and I'll put a link in the description below for you, run at the University of Queensland, tested high-intensity resistance training in postmenopausal women who already had low bone density. And the program involved heavy compound exercises like deadlifts and overhead presses and squats as well. And these produced significant improvements in bone density in the lumbar spine, the lower part of the spine, and also the femoral neck, which is the top of the thigh bone, top of the femur, and one of the most common and serious fracture sites. This is what we call a fractured neck of femur, which is basically the most common type of hip fracture in older people. And a follow-up study actually confirmed that these improvements were clinically meaningful. This matters enormously because the default advice for older adults is often to avoid heavy exercise for safety reasons. And I get that, yes, that is, needs to be considered, but for bone health specifically, it absolutely misses the point entirely. The bones need to be loaded. That is the stimulus. There's also observational data from populations in parts of Asia where deep squatting and floor sitting remain just sort of part of adult life, and where fracture rates are comparatively lower. And it supports this broader idea that your bones respond to the demands that you place on them consistently across a lifetime, not just in formal exercise sessions or calcium supplements. So osteoporosis is not simply a calcium deficiency. It is a condition driven over decades by a combination of nutritional gaps and chronic inflammation and hormonal changes and insufficient physical load on the skeleton. Handing somebody a calcium tablet addresses one small piece of a much larger picture, in the same way that giving somebody a blood pressure tablet while leaving their diet, their weight, their sleep, and activity completely unchanged addresses a number on a screen without touching the underlying cause. And we do this all the time in Western medicine. The practical steps to help this are pretty straightforward. You need to try and eat a varied diet built around whole foods that deliver calcium in the context of the other nutrients that the body needs to use it. You need to take resistance training seriously as you age as well, not just as an optional extra, but as one of the most important things that you can do for your skeleton. Get your vitamin D and your magnesium levels checked through a blood test with your doctor rather than just sort of supplementing blindly. And understand that everything you do to reduce chronic inflammation, which is eating better and moving more and sleeping better and reducing visceral fat, is working directly in your favour at the level of your bone tissue. It's also worth acknowledging that some people really do carry a higher baseline risk. So that's postmenopausal women whose estrogen levels drop really sharply after menopause, and estrogen plays a direct role in maintaining your bone density. It also includes people with a family history of osteoporosis and those who have been on long-term steroids as well, which is one of the most common drug-related causes of bone loss. If any of these apply to you, then everything in this video becomes even more important, and it's worth having a really specific conversation with your doctor about a bone density scan so you know exactly where you stand rather than just guessing. And regardless of where you're starting from, whether you have no risk factors or several risk factors, the same principles apply. The lifestyle changes that protect your bones work at every stage, and the evidence is clear that it's never too late for them to make a really meaningful difference. Your skeleton is not fixed. It responds to what you do right now, and that is an opportunity worth taking seriously.